Welcome to the latest Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.
I'm Matthew Allen, Global Head of Financial Services at Evershed Sutherland. Welcome to the latest in a series of podcasts exploring trends and opportunities in global financial markets in 2025. Each month, we'll be hearing from our clients and industry observers on a particular hot topic issue, which our own subject matter experts on both sides of the Atlantic will then reflect on in a separate podcast. Today, we'll be looking at the thorny issue of international trade and its impact on financial services. And to help us do this, I'm delighted to be joined by Nicola Watkinson, who leads the international team at TheCityUK, the industry-led body representing UK-based financial and related professional services. Nicola, welcome. It's great to have you with us today. Maybe you could just introduce yourself for the listeners and tell them a little bit about your role and your background.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for inviting me along today. I mean, what a fascinating topic, and one that is fast moving to the point that we are waking up every morning to see what the latest development might be in trade policy around the world. Something that I don't think was necessarily the case even a few years ago. So I have a background in international trade and investment. I spent a number of years with the Australian Foreign Service working in the trade area, and was lucky enough to be the Consul General in Frankfurt looking after the European markets, then based in New Delhi looking after the South Asian markets, and then in New York for 5 years working on the Americas markets. And after that, I moved over about 4 years ago to London to work in the financial and professional services industry. And here I run the international work for the TheCityUK. The TheCityUK is a premier industry body that represents the ecosystem of financial and professional services across the UK. So that means within our membership, we have the banks, the insurers, the asset managers, the market infrastructure players, legal services, advisory, training and accreditation bodies. And that allows us to have a really unique perspective on how trade policy and geopolitics more broadly is really impacting on the industry, and really lead some thinking about how we respond to that, what the challenges are for our industry, and where we might still be able to generate new opportunities.
And I know firsthand from many years' experience just what a fantastic job the TheCityUK does, fighting for trade and open and free borders for financial and related professional services. So yeah, interesting times indeed for international trade. As you said, you blink and you miss it really in terms of what's going on currently. Can you just try and unravel that a little bit for us? And what are the sort of underlying themes and issues, and sort of digging below the headlines a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if we start off, a few years ago, we were still in an environment where many markets believed in open and free liberal trade. And although there were still a lot of holes in that, and we were still seeing lots of pressure on multilateral bodies like the World Trade Organization, many of the markets that we would work with or our customers would work with were still relatively open. And what we've now seen is this is totally starting to fragment. And the issues around geopolitics and the trade implications of that have now shot up the agenda for nearly every company, even those that are purely domestically focused, are now having to think about how trade policy might impact on their supply chains, on their ability to service their clients and be able to attract the kind of talent they need, or be able just to work effectively with all the restrictions that are starting to come into place. And really what we've seen around this is the start of a move away from what we might have seen as the sort of the two superpowers, and where most of the markets were just orbiting within one of them. And we've kind of moved, one of the people I work with is saying we've gone from this sort of long-term relationship model into something that's a lot more polyamorous, where what we're finding is that we've got these three major regional blocks, obviously China, the US and Europe. We're seeing in every morning when we wake up, the tensions between these markets with tariffs being imposed. And a lot of this is being driven by economic agendas, where in Europe they're trying to protect their markets. We're seeing this sort of strategic autonomy agenda that's been growing over recent years. Obviously, in the US, we have an administration that is determined to try and bring back more companies, more production into the US, and is using a range of tools to try and do that. And China, of course, which has been really looking at how to develop its own domestic sort of giants, and has been quite prepared to use various trade policy tools to give them preferential advantage. So that has been growing, and it becomes much more complex for companies to try and work out how to be friends with all of them. And there's a danger of getting, a little bit caught in the crossfire. So I think that's the first thing that we've started to see. Well, the second thing that we've started to see, which is a little bit more of this move into what we might call this polyamorous, or what I would call a multi-aligned world, where people are deciding they don't want to choose, that they don't want to have to only be aligned to the US or only be aligned to Europe or to China, that there's ways in which they really want to be able to try and navigate between these different markets. And it looks like in this very fragmenting world that is becoming increasingly possible. And if you were just to look at a market like India, for example, it's quite happy to buy gas from Russia. It's quite happy to, at the same time, accept a lot of funding for infrastructure and so on from China. But it also really wants to engage with Europe on a free trade agreement. So it's not necessarily being made by any of these markets to have to choose between that. They all want to court India and what it has to offer. And we're seeing this in the Middle East and other markets as well.
It's a fascinating and very challenging picture. And then maybe put a financial services lens on that in particular. And I suppose my question is twofold, really. One is looking at it, obviously, in the context of how do financial services firms, make sense of that in terms of the sectors and the companies and the industries and the geographies that they bank and they finance and support in terms of the financial plumbing of international trade. That would be one part of it. And then secondly, I guess at the enterprise level, what's the position with financial services? On the one hand, they don't typically feature strongly within trade agreements, but are they going to get caught more in the crosshairs? What's the role of international regulators in terms of kind of looking through and the impact that might have on regulatory cooperation? Sorry, there's a lot there, but maybe you could try those two themes.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think it is an increasingly complex environment. So if we start on the regulatory front, what we're unfortunately seeing is an incredible fragmentation, where we were hoping to move towards, greater global consensus, whether it be on, reporting and disclosure standards for green and sustainable finance. And as just one example, what we're now finding is that there's almost this sense of regulatory arbitrage, where we are seeing in the US a potential rollback of some of the requirements around sustainable finance. At the same time, you've got the EU really trying to maintain a very strong rules-based approach, but also having to review under its new omnibus review what it's going to do in this space. And you've got some really interesting responses from emerging markets saying, well, maybe why should we start to do some of these things? We saw Indonesia come out recently. Why should we be signing up to actually implement all these standards if we're not seeing some of the markets like the US continuing to really adhere to this? So I think it's what we're finding is that the cost of compliance, the cost of doing business globally, is going to become ever higher and more complex. And there's just not really any any weight now behind a lot of the multilateral bodies like the World Trade Organization in order to be able to kind of convene and really push through a genuine approach to global solutions. But what we are seeing at the same time is a lot more regional alliances. So we've gone from a sort of a one beautiful big circle into lots of Venn diagrams, where what we're finding is there may be different alliances forming around different types of regulatory approaches to specific themes. So sitting here in the UK, for example, we would say from our financial services side of things that we might be probably more aligned with some of the work of the EU, perhaps, around things like green and sustainable finance. But when it comes to something like AI, we might really feel that we're actually probably more aligned to the way the US is thinking about some of these issues. And so this kind of reconfiguring of different alliances around different approaches to regulation is something I think we're going to see more of. And that kind of leads to your question about free trade agreements. And you're totally right. If you think back to many of the trade negotiations, usually financial services has been a bit of a poor cousin. It's either been forgotten altogether, or it's been, left to navigate through a financial services chapter that might be tacked on at the end. But what I think we're now starting to see, if you look at how trade is taking place, particularly in our industry, about 85% of the exports that are delivered in our industry out of the UK are delivered digitally. So now what's becoming increasingly important are the digital economy agreements. This is looking at issues about how data flows, looking at issues like data adequacy, data localization, agreements on AI and other forms of new technology. And the UK, for example, has negotiated some what I would say are quite sort of best-in-class agreements in this area with Japan, with Australia, and with Singapore. So these are areas where I think the industry is really starting to place more focus. So still obviously caring a lot about things like investor protection and a range of those sorts of issues, which are in the more sort of, if you like, traditional FTAs. But a lot of our focus is on these new areas where we really see our industry being potentially able to benefit from some kind of a digital economy agreement.
Really interesting, and sort of building on that then, and looking ahead to the next 12, 24 months and beyond. And there is this whipsawing and this complexity and this fragmentation and a lot of risk. But, threading the needle, where are the opportunities going to be? Where do you see the bright spots? Because there always are, but tell us where they're going to be.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's going to be a fascinating time for companies who are trying to navigate through all of this. So, I think we are going to see companies and we are seeing them responding to some of these changes in geopolitics and in trade policy by looking at where they put their different operations. So obviously a lot of companies are thinking about how do I get over the top of the barriers that are being created? How do I get inside, the walled city, so to speak? And what might that mean for where I put my business units and how I try and play with that? And being inside some of these markets, whether it's the EU and so on, can then help to create very privileged positions because as the walls go up, if you're inside the wall, then you feel in a much better place in order to be able to contest. And particularly this might be around government contracts where procurement laws might start to preference local players and insist on being able to deliver a lot of this information and a lot of the services locally. So that might be one way in which companies try and do it. At the same time, I think what we're also going to find is companies looking to diversify because what they're also seeing is that there are different pockets of opportunity for them in different areas. And one of the things that we did at the City UK recently is really look at where are the growth corridors for trade. And it's very interesting when you look, if, for example, sitting here in the UK, what we tend to look at is from the UK out to other markets. And they're generally, and this would be the case for the most of Europe as well, the growth trends are about 2 to 3% in terms of trade flow growth. But if you were to be looking at where the big growth is, it's in markets like, say, Saudi Arabia to China. It's around Gulf to India, India to Africa, and within the intra-ASEAN markets. These kind of growth corridors are ticking up at around 6 to 7% a year. And for our companies, that offers a huge amount of opportunity. So for companies to think about how they can service those corridors, and we have a number of our members who would say at the moment that they're working out of maybe their office in Beijing, and their biggest growth is coming from the deals that they're helping to facilitate between China and Saudi and other parts of the Middle East. So bringing that UK, in this case, expertise into that market in order to help to service those corridors has been a huge area of growth. And we're also finding, other companies really looking at these, at how they can service, whether it's things like M&A work, whether it's in terms of financing arrangements, debt financing arrangements for a lot of the trade finance that's going on. So I think these are areas where we see a lot, and obviously a lot of the advisory work that's happening in that space too, where perhaps there is a trust deficit that still exists between some of these markets, and being able to offer services from a trusted neutral partner, say, for example, in this case, out of the UK, can be something that is really sought after. So those are some of the areas that we're thinking about. And I think also then looking at how these geopolitical dynamics may shift trade flows. So what we're also going to start to see as we look into the future is, with this turbulence and with some markets perhaps finding themselves out of favor with some of these big superpowers, where might they actually look to invest? So could markets like the UK, if you like, become a much more safe and predictable place to put your investment, one where you feel that you may not be in the crossfires of some of these trade wars that we're seeing playing out at the moment, or where you're less likely to sort of be in a market that falls out of favor and finds itself being excluded? So I think these are also something for companies to be thinking about as they look forward into the next year or so. It's hard to look too much more forward at the moment, but I think that those are some of the opportunities that might exist to think about how you could service your clients who might be trying to think about where they do this. And I know just recently from talking to one of our members that they've seen 2 large investments starting to come into the UK precisely around this these decision-making factors.
Nicola, thanks very much for making sense of the complexity for us, and maybe we'll get you back in a year's time and we can see if you were right, but lots to think about. Thanks again for joining us today and for your really helpful insights. Of course, thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us as always. If you'd like to know more about the work of the City UK and the trade issues we've been discussing, I'm sure Nicola and her colleagues will be delighted to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to get in touch, and we can pass on contact details if they're needed. Please also look out for the next podcast in the series with Evershed Sutherland Partners, reflecting on some of what Nicola has shared with us today. That will appear on all our usual social media channels in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.